Imagine a battlefield so brutal, so hopelessly deadlocked, that every new weapon, every new tactic, seemed to vanish into the mud and blood of no man's land. Now, picture a machine massive, armored, and unlike anything the world had ever seen, rolling out onto that battlefield for the very first time. Its engine roars, its steel tracks churn through the mire, and for a brief, electrifying moment, the impossible seems within reach. But here's the twist: this very machine, the one destined to shatter the deadliest stalemate in history, was first dismissed as a complete failure. Not just by critics or rivals, but by the American military itself, who called it useless, impractical, and a waste of resources. They saw only flaws, not potential. They couldn't imagine that this rejected invention would soon become the most important weapon of the 20th century. The story of the tank doesn't begin with glory or triumph. It begins with humiliation, skepticism, and a single British engineer whose name is almost forgotten today. William Ashby Triton was not a general, not a politician, not even a soldier. He was a quiet, obsessive tinkerer from London, a man who spent his childhood taking apart clocks and his adulthood wrestling with engines and gears. No one expected him to change the world. In fact, when he first presented his radical new design to the military, the response was almost laughable. American officials, after a single demonstration, wrote it off as a technological dead end. They recommended that the United States invest in more artillery, more infantry, anything but this lumbering, unreliable contraption. But history has a way of turning failures into legends. As World War I dragged on, as the trenches filled with the bodies of men who had nowhere to run and no way to advance, the rejected machine was quietly being transformed. In secret workshops, under impossible deadlines, Triton and his team worked day and night, driven by a single, desperate question. Could they build something that would save lives instead of wasting them? Could they break the deadlock that was grinding an entire generation into dust? The answer, as it turned out, would change warfare forever. But in 1917, no one could see that future. All they saw was a clumsy prototype, overheating engines, and a design so strange it looked more like a science fiction nightmare than a weapon of war. The Americans walked away, convinced they'd witnessed the birth of a spectacular failure. They had no idea that within a year, their own soldiers would be begging for these very machines, and that the fate of the war and the world would hinge on the invention they had so casually dismissed. So how did it happen? How did a rejected prototype, scorned by experts and ridiculed by generals, become the secret weapon that broke the bloodiest stalemate in history? How did a quiet engineer from London, with no military background and no support from the world's greatest industrial power, manage to outthink and outbuild the entire military establishment? And what does this story reveal about the true nature of innovation, the cost of progress, and the hidden power of those who work in the shadows? To answer those questions, we have to go back, not to the trenches of France, but to the crowded streets of Islington, London, in the late 19th century. We have to meet a boy who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, if only someone was willing to take it apart and put it back together again. We have to follow his journey from obscurity to obsession, from failure to triumph, and from rejection to a legacy that would shape the future of warfare for generations to come. But before we dive into the details of Triton's life and the birth of the tank, let's pause for a moment and consider the stakes. World War I was not just another conflict. It was a cataclysm that shattered empires, redrew borders, and introduced horrors the world had never seen. The trenches of the Western Front were more than just lines on a map. They were graveyards for hope, innovation, and human life. Every day, thousands of men went over the top, only to be cut down by machine guns, shredded by artillery, or swallowed by mud. The generals tried everything: new tactics, new weapons, even poison gas. Nothing worked. The war ground on year after year, with no end in sight. In this world of despair, the idea of a machine that could cross no man's land, crush barbed wire, and shield soldiers from bullets sounded like pure fantasy. Most experts dismissed it out of hand. The Americans, in particular, were scathing in their criticism. Their official report didn't just reject the tank. It mocked the very idea of mechanized warfare. Slow, vulnerable, and expensive, they wrote. A distraction from real military needs. It was a verdict that could have killed the project forever. But William Triton was not the kind of man to give up easily. He saw something that others missed: the potential for a new kind of warfare, one where machines could do what men could not. He understood that every great invention starts as a failure, that every breakthrough is born from rejection. And so, while the world laughed, he went back to his workshop, determined to prove them all wrong. What happened next would stun the world. The rejected machine, the so-called useless invention, would roll onto the battlefield and change the course of history. It would save thousands of lives, terrify the enemy, and force even the harshest critics to admit they were wrong. The Americans, who had once turned their backs, would come begging for Triton's help, and the quiet engineer from London would become the unlikely father of modern warfare. But that's only the beginning, because the story of the tank is not just about machines and battles. It's about the power of persistence, the danger of groupthink, and the way history is shaped not by the loudest voices, but by those who refuse to accept the limits of what's possible. It's a story of obsession, sacrifice, and the thin line between genius and madness. So, if you think you know how innovation happens, if you believe that the best ideas are always recognized, that the experts are always right, and that progress is a straight line from failure to success, think again. The story of William Triton and his rejected machine will make you question everything you thought you knew about invention, war, and the hidden forces that shape our world. And as we peel back the layers of this incredible story, you'll discover secrets, controversies, and untold truths that most history books leave out. Because sometimes, the most important revolutions begin not with a bang, but with a quiet refusal to give up. But who was William Triton, really? And what drove him to keep going when everyone else had given up? The answers lie in a childhood obsession, a relentless pursuit of perfection, and a moment of inspiration that would change the world forever. And what happened next would shock even his harshest critics. To understand how a single engineer could change the course of history, you have to start far from the battlefields of Europe. You have to go back to the narrow, bustling streets of Islington, London, in the late 1800s, a world of horse-drawn carts, gas lamps, and the constant clatter of industry. It was here on June 14, 1875, that William Ashby Triton was born into a family that seemed, at first glance, entirely ordinary. His father, a cloth merchant, spent his days haggling over bolts of fabric and balancing ledgers. His mother managed the household with a firm hand and little patience for nonsense. There was no hint of military tradition, no family legacy of invention or adventure. If anything, the Tritons were the kind of people who believed in hard work, respectability, and keeping your head down. But from the very beginning, William was different. He was the kind of child who saw the world not as a fixed set of rules, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. While other boys played in the streets, William was drawn to the mysterious workings of the machines that powered Victorian London. He would stand for hours outside the local blacksmith's shop, mesmerized by the hiss of steam and the clang of metal. He asked endless questions about gears, about levers, about why things worked the way they did. Most adults found him exhausting. His teachers, in particular, were baffled by his refusal to simply memorize facts and move on. William wanted to know why. The first real sign of his mechanical genius came when he was just 12 years old. One rainy afternoon, left alone in the family's cramped living room, William turned his attention to the old wall clock that had ticked away the hours for as long as he could remember. To most people, it was just a piece of furniture. To William, it was a challenge. He carefully removed the clock from the wall, pried open the back, and began to take it apart, gear by gear, spring by spring. By the time his mother returned, the floor was covered in a chaotic sea of tiny brass pieces. She was understandably furious, but William was undeterred. For 3 days he worked in secret, poring over every component, cleaning, adjusting, and reassembling the clock with a precision that seemed almost unnatural for a child his age. When he finally hung it back on the wall, not only did it work, it kept time more accurately than ever before. That moment was more than just a childhood prank. It was a glimpse into the mind of someone who would never accept things as they were. William Triton was not content to simply use machines. He needed to understand them, to improve them, to push them beyond their limits. It was a trait that would define his entire life, and eventually change the world. But genius, especially the restless, obsessive kind, is rarely easy to live with. As William grew older, his fascination with machinery only deepened. He spent hours sketching designs in the margins of his schoolbooks, dreaming up new ways to make engines run faster, smoother, more efficiently. His parents, practical people, grew increasingly concerned. They wanted their son to follow a safe, respectable path, perhaps as a clerk or a teacher, or even, if he was lucky, a small business owner. Engineering, in their eyes, was a risky business, full of uncertainty and disappointment. At 16, William made a decision that would horrify his family and set him on a path that few could have predicted. He abandoned formal education, walking away from the Latin and philosophy lessons that his parents believed were the key to a better life. Instead, he sought out an apprenticeship at a small engineering workshop in London. The pay was meager, the hours brutal, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, in a noisy, dangerous environment where accidents were common and mistakes could be fatal. But for William, it was paradise. Here, surrounded by the smell of oil and the heat of the forge, he could finally immerse himself in the world of machines. The apprenticeship was a trial by fire. William was expected to master every aspect of mechanical engineering, from reading complex technical drawings to welding metal with a steady hand. He stayed late into the night, memorizing the properties of different alloys, experimenting with new techniques, and pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion. His peers thought he was obsessive, maybe even a little unhinged. But his masters saw something rare, a mind that could not only understand the most intricate mechanisms, but also see how they could be improved. By the time he was 21, William had earned a reputation as a problem solver, the kind of engineer who could fix anything, no matter how hopeless it seemed. He landed a job at a locomotive company in Leeds, a city at the heart of Britain's industrial revolution. The work was grueling and often dangerous. Each locomotive was a unique puzzle, a massive, fire-breathing beast that demanded respect and ingenuity. William thrived on the challenge. He became known for his ability to diagnose problems that baffled even the most experienced engineers, often working through the night to get a stalled engine back on the rails. But it wasn't just technical skill that set William apart. It was his relentless curiosity, his refusal to accept good enough as an answer. He kept notebooks filled with sketches, calculations, and wild ideas, some practical, some bordering on the impossible. He was fascinated by the idea of machines that could do more than anyone had ever imagined, machines that could change the way people lived, worked, and even fought. In 1905, William's career took a decisive turn. He was hired by William Foster and Company, an agricultural manufacturer based in Lincoln. At first glance, it seemed like a step backward, a company known for tractors and farm equipment, not cutting-edge technology. But Foster and Company was quietly experimenting with motor vehicles, a field that was still in its infancy. William saw an opportunity. He threw himself into the work, developing new tractors that were more powerful and efficient than anything on the market. His innovations quickly caught the attention of the company's leadership, and in 1911, at just 36 years old, he was promoted to managing director, a position of enormous responsibility and influence. As managing director, William transformed Foster and Company into a leader in agricultural machinery. He introduced new manufacturing techniques, streamlined production, and pushed his team to embrace innovation at every turn. Under his guidance, the company developed tractors that could plow fields faster, haul heavier loads, and withstand the harshest conditions. Farmers across Britain began to take notice, and Foster and Company's reputation soared. But even as he built a successful career, William remained restless. He was always searching for the next big challenge, the next unsolved problem. He read voraciously, keeping up with the latest developments in engineering, physics, and technology. He was fascinated by the rapid changes sweeping across Europe. The rise of the automobile, the spread of electricity, the promise of flight. He saw a world on the brink of transformation, and he wanted to be part of it. Yet, for all his ambition, William paid little attention to the political tensions simmering across the continent. The headlines about diplomatic crises, military alliances, and the growing threat of war seemed distant, almost irrelevant to a man consumed by the inner workings of engines and gears. He focused on his machines, convinced that progress was a matter of technical mastery, not political maneuvering. That would all change in the summer of 1914. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction that would plunge Europe into the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. Within weeks, Britain was at war with Germany, and the old certainties of the pre-war world vanished overnight. Factories that had once produced tractors and locomotives were suddenly being asked to build weapons, ammunition, and vehicles for the military. The entire nation was mobilized for war. William Triton was 39 years old when the war began, too old for combat, but not too old to serve. His skills as an engineer were suddenly in high demand. The British military, facing unprecedented challenges on the Western Front, began to look for creative minds who could solve problems that had never been faced before. The trenches of France and Belgium had become a nightmare of mud, barbed wire, and machine gun fire, a place where traditional tactics had failed and new solutions were desperately needed. It was in this crucible of crisis that William Triton's unique talents would finally find their purpose. The quiet boy who had once taken apart his family's clock was about to be given the chance to take apart and rebuild the very nature of warfare itself. He didn't know it yet, but the next few years would test him in ways he could never have imagined. He would face failure, ridicule, and heartbreak, but he would also discover a kind of genius that could only emerge under the most extreme pressure. And as the world descended into chaos, William Triton would be called upon to invent something that had never existed before. A machine that could break the deadliest stalemate in history. The journey from a London workshop to the battlefields of France was about to begin. But the path would be anything but straightforward. It would be marked by setbacks, betrayals, and moments of inspiration that would change the world forever. What drove William Triton to keep going when others would have given up? Was it ambition, patriotism, or something deeper? A relentless need to solve the unsolvable, to prove that even the most ordinary person could change the course of history. As we follow his journey from the backstreets of Islington to the heart of the war machine, we'll uncover the secrets of a mind that refused to accept limits and a spirit that would not be broken by failure. But the real test was still to come. The world was about to ask William Triton for the impossible, and against all odds, he was about to deliver. The world William Triton knew was vanishing, swept away by a storm of violence that no one had truly anticipated. The summer of 1914 began with the usual optimism of a new season, but it ended with the world teetering on the edge of disaster. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the spark, but the fire that followed was fueled by decades of rivalry, suspicion, and ambition among Europe's great powers. Alliances that were meant to keep the peace instead became chains, dragging nation after nation into a conflict that would soon engulf the globe. For most people, the outbreak of war was a shock. For William Triton, it was a distant thunder, rumbling at the edge of his world of gears and engines. He read the headlines, heard the rumors, but he was not a man of politics or strategy. He was an engineer, and his mind was always on the next problem to solve, the next machine to perfect. Yet, as the weeks passed and the scale of the conflict became clear, even Triton could not ignore the reality that was closing in on every corner of British life. Factories across the country were commandeered for the war effort. The government issued urgent calls for weapons, vehicles, and supplies. Foster and Company, under Triton's leadership, shifted from building tractors to producing equipment for the military. The transition was chaotic, but Triton's relentless drive and organizational genius kept the factory running at full speed. He streamlined production, retooled machines, and pushed his workers to meet impossible deadlines. The pressure was immense, but Triton thrived on it. He believed that every bolt tightened, every engine tested, was a small blow struck against the enemy. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that this was not a conflict that could be won by industry alone. The Western Front, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, had become a vast, nightmarish labyrinth of trenches, barbed wire and mud. Soldiers lived and died in these trenches, enduring constant shellfire, disease, and the ever-present threat of attack. The land between the opposing lines, no man's land, was a wasteland of craters, shattered trees, and the twisted remains of earlier assaults. Every attempt to break through the enemy's defenses ended in disaster. Waves of men went over the top, only to be cut down by machine gun fire or blown apart by artillery before they could advance more than a few yards. The scale of the slaughter was almost unimaginable. At the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. The generals, trained in the tactics of earlier wars, were slow to adapt. They believed that courage and discipline would eventually carry the day, that enough men charging at the enemy would break the deadlock. But the reality was different. Defensive technology, machine guns, barbed wire, and rapid-firing artillery had outpaced offensive tactics. The result was a stalemate that seemed unbreakable, a war of attrition that threatened to grind on forever. It was in this desperate context that a few visionary minds began to search for a new solution. Among them was Colonel Ernest Swinton, a British Army officer and military writer who had witnessed the carnage firsthand. Swinton was haunted by the sight of men being slaughtered in futile attacks, and he became obsessed with the idea of finding a way to protect them. He imagined an armored vehicle impervious to bullets that could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and carry soldiers safely through no man's land. It would be a mobile fortress, a machine that could finally break the deadlock and restore movement to the battlefield. Swinton's idea was radical, even heretical. Most of his superiors dismissed it as fantasy. The British Army, like most militaries of the time, was deeply conservative. Generals clung to the traditions of cavalry and infantry, convinced that the old ways would eventually prevail. The notion of a landship, a massive, armored vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine, seemed like something out of a science fiction novel. But Swinton was persistent. He wrote memos, lobbied influential friends, and refused to let the idea die. He found an unexpected ally in Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill was a man who understood the value of innovation, especially in times of crisis. He saw the potential in Swinton's vision and moved quickly to support it. In February 1915, Churchill established the Landships Committee, a secret group tasked with turning the concept of armored vehicles into reality. The name itself was a deliberate deception, meant to mislead German spies into thinking the British were working on water tanks, not weapons of war. The committee faced a daunting challenge. The technology of the time was barely up to the task. Automobiles were still unreliable, prone to breakdowns and incapable of handling rough terrain. The idea of building a vehicle that could cross trenches, withstand machine, gun fire, and carry heavy weapons seemed almost impossible. But Churchill and Swinton were determined to try. They needed someone with the right combination of practical experience, technical brilliance, and sheer stubbornness to make it happen. That someone was William Triton. Triton was summoned to a secret meeting in London in March 1915. The military officials who greeted him were tense, their faces drawn with exhaustion and worry. They explained the problem in stark terms. The British Army needed an armored vehicle that could cross trenches up to 8 feet wide, crush barbed wire, withstand machine gun fire, and carry enough firepower to support an infantry assault. And they needed it as soon as possible. The fate of thousands of soldiers, and perhaps the outcome of the entire war, depended on finding a solution. Most engineers would have balked at the challenge. The specifications were, by the standards of the day, almost absurd. The engines available were underpowered and unreliable. Armor plate was heavy and difficult to work with. The track systems used on existing vehicles were primitive and prone to failure. But Triton was not most engineers. He listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and took detailed notes. By the end of the meeting, he had already begun sketching ideas in the margins of his notebook. Returning to Lincoln, Triton threw himself into the project with his usual intensity. He knew that the odds were against him, but he also knew that the stakes had never been higher. His factory, which had once produced farm tractors, was now the cradle of a new era in warfare. He assembled a small team of trusted engineers and mechanics, men who shared his passion for innovation and his willingness to work around the clock. Among them was Major Walter Gordon Wilson, a brilliant naval engineer whose theoretical expertise complemented Triton's practical genius. The two men were opposites in temperament. Triton was direct and impatient, Wilson meticulous and methodical. But together they formed a partnership that would prove crucial to the project's success. The first prototype, dubbed Little Willie, was a disaster. It used conventional wheels at the rear and short tracks at the front, but during testing in August 1915, it got stuck in the first ditch it tried to cross. The wheels sank into the mud, the engine overheated, and the steering system was almost impossible to control. Triton was frustrated but not defeated. He spent days analyzing every failure, making meticulous notes and refusing to accept defeat. He understood that every setback was a lesson, every failure a step closer to success. In September 1915, Triton had a breakthrough. He realized that the fundamental problem was the shape of the vehicle and the length of the tracks. What if, instead of placing the tracks only under the vehicle, he wrapped them around the entire body, creating a rhomboid shape that would allow the tank to cross wide trenches and distribute its weight more evenly? It was a radical idea, one that violated every principle of vehicle design at the time. Wilson was skeptical at first, but as they worked through the details, it became clear that this was the solution they had been searching for. The new prototype, called Mother, was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It looked like a giant metal box with caterpillar tracks encircling its entire body. 6-pounder cannons protruded from the sides, and the whole machine weighed nearly 30 tons. In January 1916, Mother was ready for testing. A crowd of skeptical military officers gathered in Lincoln to watch. Many bet that the machine wouldn't even move. Triton, nervous but confident, had personally checked every system. When the engine roared to life and Mother began to move, the crowd was stunned. The tank crossed a simulated trench with ease, crushed barbed wire, and proved almost impervious to rifle fire. The skeptics were silenced. The British Army immediately ordered 100 units, and the project was given a new, secretive name, Tank. But even as Triton and his team celebrated their success, new challenges loomed. The Americans, who had been invited to observe the new weapon, were unimpressed. Their official report dismissed the tank as slow, vulnerable, and a waste of resources. They recommended that the United States focus on artillery and infantry, not on what they saw as a technological dead end. It was a stinging rejection, one that could have ended the project before it truly began. Yet, in the mud and blood of the Western Front, the need for a breakthrough was more urgent than ever. The generals, desperate for any advantage, decided to give the tank a chance. The first deployment at the Battle of the Somme was a mixed success. Many tanks broke down or got stuck, but a few managed to reach the German lines, striking terror into the enemy and proving that the concept was sound. The world was changing, and William Triton was at the center of that change. The quiet engineer from Islington, who had once taken apart clocks for fun, was now building machines that would alter the course of history. The war had created a problem that seemed unsolvable, but Triton's relentless curiosity and refusal to accept defeat had given the Allies a new weapon and a new hope. But the journey was far from over. The tank was still a work in progress, plagued by technical problems and skepticism from all sides. Triton would have to fight not just the enemy, but also the doubts of his own allies, the limitations of technology, and the relentless pressure of a world at war. The next chapter in his story would be one of humiliation, heartbreak, and ultimately redemption. Because in the crucible of war, even the most unlikely genius can become a legend. And sometimes, the greatest innovations are born not from triumph, but from the desperate need to survive. The challenge that landed on William Triton's desk in 1915 was nothing short of impossible. The British military's requirements read like a wish list from a science fiction novels: an armored vehicle that could cross trenches 8 feet wide, crush barbed wire, withstand machine gun fire, and carry enough firepower to support an infantry assault. It had to be fast enough to keep up with advancing troops, reliable enough to survive the hellish conditions of the Western Front, and simple enough to be built quickly and in large numbers. And as if that weren't enough, it had to be ready in a matter of months. For most engineers, the task would have been overwhelming. But for Triton, it was the ultimate test. A puzzle so complex, so urgent, that it demanded every ounce of his ingenuity. He returned to Lincoln with a head full of ideas and a sense of responsibility that weighed heavier than any piece of armor plate. The fate of thousands of soldiers, perhaps the outcome of the entire war, depended on his ability to turn fantasy into reality. The first step was assembling a team. Triton handpicked a small group of engineers and mechanics, men he trusted not just for their technical skills, but for their willingness to work around the clock, to question every assumption, and to risk failure in pursuit of something truly new. Among them was Major Walter Gordon Wilson, a naval engineer whose theoretical brilliance complemented Triton's practical genius. The two men were opposites in temperament. Triton was blunt and impatient, Wilson meticulous and methodical, but together they formed a partnership that would prove essential to the project's success. The team set up shop in the heart of Foster and Company's factory, transforming the familiar world of tractors and plows into a secret laboratory for military innovation. The work was grueling. The factory floor, once filled with the steady rhythm of agricultural machinery, now echoed with the clang of armor plate, the hiss of welding torches, and the constant hum of debate and experimentation. Triton barely slept, often spending nights at his workbench, sketching new designs or poring over technical manuals by the light of a single lamp. The first prototype, dubbed Little Willie, was a product of both ambition and compromise. It used a pair of short tracks at the front and conventional wheels at the rear, a design borrowed from existing agricultural tractors. The armor was thick enough to stop rifle bullets, and the engine, an adapted Daimler, was the most powerful the team could find. But from the beginning, the problems were obvious. The vehicle was slow, cumbersome, and prone to overheating. During its first test in August 1915, Little Willie got stuck in the very first ditch it tried to cross. The wheels sank into the mud, the tracks jammed, and the steering system proved almost impossible to control. The military observers, many of whom had been skeptical from the start, were quick to dismiss the project as a failure. For Triton, the setback was devastating, but not surprising. He had known from the beginning that the first attempt would be a learning experience, a way to identify the flaws that needed to be fixed. He spent days analyzing every aspect of the prototype, making meticulous notes on what had gone wrong and why. The fundamental problem, he realized, was the shape of the vehicle and the length of the tracks. The short tracks couldn't span wide trenches, and the rear wheels were a liability in the mud of the Western Front. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that Triton had his breakthrough. What if, instead of placing the tracks only under the vehicle, he wrapped them around the entire body, creating a rhomboid shape that would allow the tank to cross wide trenches and distribute its weight more evenly? It was a radical idea, one that violated every principle of vehicle design at the time. Wilson was skeptical at first, but as they worked through the details, it became clear that this was the solution they had been searching for. The new design, which would become known as Mother, was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It looked like a giant metal box with caterpillar tracks encircling its entire body. The sides bristled with 6-pounder cannons and machine guns, and the whole machine weighed nearly 30 tons. The engine, 105 horsepower Daimler, was barely powerful enough to move the massive vehicle, but it was the best they could manage with the technology available. Building Mother was a race against time. The pressure from the military was relentless. Every day brought new reports from the front, more casualties, more failed attacks, more evidence that the war was grinding to a halt. Triton and his team worked around the clock, improvising solutions to problems that no one had ever faced before. They experimented with different types of armor, tested new track designs, and devised ways to keep the engine from overheating. Every setback was met with determination, every failure with a renewed sense of urgency. The secrecy surrounding the project was intense. The British government was desperate to keep the existence of the tank hidden from the Germans, who were rumored to be working on their own armored vehicles. The project was given the deliberately misleading code name, Tank, to suggest that the new machines were simply water carriers for the troops at the front. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and security at the factory was tighter than ever. By January 1916, Mother was ready for its first public test. The event was shrouded in secrecy, with military officials and engineers gathering in Lincoln to witness the debut of the world's first true battle tank. Many of the observers were openly skeptical. Some had bet that the machine wouldn't even move. Others predicted that it would break down before it reached the first obstacle. Triton, exhausted but confident, had personally checked every system. When the engine roared to life and Mother began to move, the crowd was stunned. The tank crossed a simulated trench with ease, crushed barbed wire, and proved almost impervious to rifle fire. The skeptics were silenced. The British Army immediately ordered 100 units, and the project shifted into high gear. But the challenges were far from over. Mass-producing the tank required a complete overhaul of the factory's operations. The materials needed, armor plate, engines, tracks, were in short supply, and every component had to be built to exacting standards. Triton worked tirelessly to solve each new problem, often inventing new tools and techniques on the fly. He trained his workers personally, insisting on the highest levels of precision and discipline. The pressure took a toll on everyone involved. Triton's health began to suffer. He developed chronic insomnia, stomach ulcers, and a persistent cough that refused to go away. But he refused to slow down. He believed that every hour spent in the factory was an hour that could save lives at the front. His team, inspired by his dedication, pushed themselves to the limit. As the first tanks rolled off the assembly line, the sense of anticipation was palpable. The machines were shipped to France under the strictest secrecy, their true purpose known only to a select few. The soldiers who would operate them were given special training, learning how to drive, maintain, and fight in a vehicle that was unlike anything they had ever seen. The first deployment of the tanks at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916 was a mixed success. Many of the machines broke down or got stuck in the mud, but a few managed to reach the German lines, striking terror into the enemy and proving that the concept was sound. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, the Germans faced a weapon they could not stop, a machine that could cross their defenses and bring the fight to their trenches. But the real test was still to come. The tank was still a work in progress, plagued by technical problems and skepticism from all sides. Triton would have to fight not just the enemy, but also the doubts of his own allies, the limitations of technology, and the relentless pressure of a world at war. Yet, in the crucible of war, something extraordinary was happening. The impossible was becoming possible. The rejected machine, the so-called useless invention, was proving its worth on the battlefield. And at the center of it all was William Triton, the quiet engineer who refused to accept defeat. The story of the tank is not just a story of machines and battles. It is a story of obsession, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of a dream. It is a story of how one man's refusal to give up changed the course of history. And as the war raged on, the world would soon see just how powerful that dream could be. But even as the tanks began to make their mark on the battlefield, a new challenge was looming on the horizon. The Americans, who had once dismissed the tank as a failure, were about to deliver a verdict that would shake Triton to his core. The next chapter in his journey would be one of humiliation, heartbreak, and ultimately redemption. Because in the race to build the impossible, the greatest obstacles are often not the ones you expect. The first tanks to roll off the assembly lines in Lincoln were more than just machines. They were the embodiment of hope, desperation, and the relentless drive of William Triton and his team. Each one was a testament to sleepless nights, burned hands, and the kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept defeat. But as the first Mark I tanks were loaded onto ships bound for France, Triton knew that the real test was still to come. The battlefield would be the ultimate judge, and the world was watching. Yet, even before the tanks saw combat, a different kind of trial was unfolding, one that would cut deeper than any mechanical failure. In March 1916, as rumors of the British landship project began to circulate, the United States War Department sent a delegation of military observers to England. America was still officially neutral, but its leaders were keenly interested in any new technology that might tip the balance of the war. The British, eager to impress their powerful ally, arranged a private demonstration of the Mark I tank at a military base near London. William Triton was there in person, his nerves stretched taut as piano wire. He had spent months preparing for this moment, overseeing every detail of the demonstration. The American delegation was led by Colonel Samuel Hough, a veteran artillery officer with a reputation for bluntness and skepticism. Hough and his team arrived with notebooks in hand, their faces set in expressions of polite but unmistakable doubt. The demonstration began with the usual fanfare. The Mark I rumbled onto the field, its engine growling, its tracks churning up the earth. Triton explained the tank's features: its thick armor, its 6-pounder cannons, its ability to cross trenches and crush barbed wire. The Americans watched in silence, their eyes narrowed, their pens scratching quietly across the pages. At first, everything went according to plan. The tank crossed a simulated trench, smashed through a barrier of barbed wire, and shrugged off a volley of rifle fire. But then, as if on cue, the problems began to surface. The engine sputtered and coughed, the interior temperature soared past 40 degrees Celsius, and the steering system, already a notorious headache, required the coordinated effort of 4 men just to keep the tank moving in a straight line. The Mark I lurched and groaned, its movements awkward and ungainly. When the demonstration ended, the Americans gathered for a private conference. Triton waited outside, his heart pounding. He knew the tank was far from perfect, but he hoped that the Americans would see its potential, that they would understand what it could become with time and refinement. Instead, the verdict was swift and brutal. Colonel Hough's official report pulled no punches. "This machine represents fundamentally flawed military thinking," he wrote. "It is slow, vulnerable, and expensive. The resources spent building these monsters would be better spent producing additional artillery and training more infantry." The report concluded that tanks were a technological dead end, a waste of valuable industrial resources. The recommendation was clear: the United States should not invest in tank development or production. The rejection was a crushing blow. Triton had poured his heart and soul into the project, sacrificing his health, his time, and his peace of mind. Now, one of the world's greatest industrial powers had dismissed his life's work as a failure. The news spread quickly through the British military and government. Some officials, already skeptical of the tank's value, seized on the American report as proof that the project was a mistake. Critics in the press began to question the wisdom of spending so much money and effort on a weapon that even the Americans didn't want. For Triton, the humiliation was almost unbearable. He retreated to his workshop, burying himself in work, refusing to speak to reporters or attend public meetings. Letters from this period reveal a man on the edge of despair. "They see only problems, not potential," he wrote to a friend. "They don't understand that this is a technology in its infancy. Every great invention begins as a failure. The first steam engines were dangerous and unreliable. The first airplanes barely flew. But we did not give up on them. Why should we give up on this?" But the doubts were not just external. Triton's own confidence began to waver. He replayed the demonstration in his mind, obsessing over every mistake, every flaw. He wondered if the critics were right, if he had wasted years chasing a fantasy. The pressure from the military was relentless. The generals wanted results, and they wanted them now. Every breakdown, every delay, was another mark against the tank and against Triton himself. The first real test came in September 1916, when the British Army deployed the Mark I tanks in combat for the first time during the Battle of the Somme. The plan was ambitious, a massive surprise attack that would finally break the trench stalemate. 49 tanks were sent into battle, their crews hastily trained, their machines barely tested. The results were, in many ways, a disaster. Many of the tanks broke down before reaching the front lines. Others became trapped in bomb craters or immobilized by mud. Of the 49 tanks, only 9 actually reached the German trenches. The critics pounced. Newspapers ran headlines mocking the "white elephants" of the battlefield. Some British officials began to question whether the investment was worthwhile. The American report, with its scathing assessment, was cited again and again as evidence that the tank was a failed experiment. Triton, however, refused to give up. He argued passionately that the tanks had been misused, deployed in insufficient numbers and without adequate infantry support. He insisted that, given time and proper tactics, the tank would prove its worth. He pointed to the 9 tanks that had reached the enemy lines, noting that they had struck terror into the Germans and allowed the infantry to advance further than in any previous attack. But his words fell on deaf ears. The mood in London was grim, and the future of the tank was in doubt. Behind the scenes, Triton worked obsessively to address the tank's flaws. He redesigned the steering system, improved the engine, and experimented with new types of armor. He spent long hours with the crews, listening to their complaints and suggestions, learning from their experiences in the field. He kept meticulous notebooks, documenting every problem and every solution. His determination was unshakable, even as his health continued to deteriorate under the strain. The months that followed were some of the darkest of Triton's life. The tank project was under constant threat of cancellation. Funding was uncertain, and political support was wavering. Triton's enemies within the military bureaucracy saw an opportunity to kill the project once and for all. They argued that the resources devoted to tanks would be better spent elsewhere, that the dream of armored warfare was a dangerous distraction from the real business of winning the war. But Triton was not alone. A small but growing group of supporters within the military and government continued to believe in the tank's potential. They pointed to the psychological impact the tanks had on the enemy, the way German soldiers had panicked and fled at the sight of the armored monsters. They argued that the technology was still in its infancy, that every new weapon faces setbacks and failures before it reaches its full potential. One of Triton's most important allies was General Julian Byng, a forward-thinking officer who saw the tank as the key to breaking the deadlock on the Western Front. Byng lobbied for more tanks, more training, and more support. He worked closely with Triton, sharing ideas and strategies, pushing for improvements and innovations. Together, they began to plan a new kind of attack, one that would use tanks not as isolated novelties, but as the spearhead of a coordinated assault. As 1917 dawned, the future of the tank hung in the balance. The Americans had turned their backs, the British establishment was divided, and the enemy was adapting. Triton knew that the next battle would be decisive. If the tanks failed again, the project would almost certainly be abandoned. But if they succeeded, if they could break through the German lines and prove their worth beyond any doubt, then everything would change. Triton threw himself into the work with renewed energy. He oversaw the development of new models, incorporating lessons learned from the battlefield. He pushed for better training for the crews, better coordination with the infantry, and better maintenance for the machines. He worked day and night, driven by a sense of urgency that bordered on obsession. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity. Triton understood that he was standing at the crossroads of history. The tank was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of what was possible when imagination, determination, and courage came together in the face of overwhelming odds. He refused to let the dream die, no matter how many times it was rejected, ridiculed, or dismissed. And so, as the world waited and doubted, William Triton prepared for the next great test. The humiliation of America's rejection still burned, but it was also a source of motivation, a reminder that the greatest innovations are often those that no one believes in at first. The next battle would be his chance to prove them all wrong. What happened next would not only vindicate Triton, but would also change the course of the war, and the future of warfare itself. The stage was set for redemption, and the world was about to witness the true power of the machine they had once called useless. The months following the American rejection were some of the bleakest in William Triton's life. The tank project, once hailed as a potential war winner, now teetered on the edge of extinction. Critics in the press and the military bureaucracy circled like vultures, eager to declare the experiment a costly failure. Triton's health suffered under the relentless pressure, but he refused to let go of his vision. He knew that the tank's true potential had yet to be realized, and he was determined to prove it, no matter the cost. The opportunity for redemption came in the autumn of 1917, in the battered fields near the French city of Cambrai. General Julian Byng, one of the few high-ranking officers who truly believed in the tank, had been given command of the British Third Army. Byng was a man of innovation, unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom. He saw in the tank not just a weapon, but a way to break the deadlock that had consumed the Western Front for years. The plan for Cambrai was audacious. Instead of using tanks as isolated novelties, Byng envisioned a massive, coordinated assault, hundreds of tanks advancing together, supported by carefully synchronized infantry and artillery. It would be the largest tank operation in history, a bold gamble that could either vindicate Triton's life's work or doom it forever. Triton followed the preparations from Lincoln with a mixture of anxiety and hope. He had personally overseen the training of many of the tank crews, sharing every lesson learned from past failures. He knew the machines were still far from perfect. Engines could overheat, tracks could break, and the interior was a hellish furnace of noise and fumes. But he also knew that, for the first time, the tanks would be used as he had always intended, en masse, with proper support and with a clear, unified objective. On the morning of November 20, 1917, as dawn broke over the frost-covered fields, 476 Mark IV tanks rumbled into position. The ground was firm, ideal for tank operations, and a thick morning mist provided cover from enemy observation. At precisely 6:20 a.m., the assault began. The tanks moved forward in coordinated waves, their engines roaring, their tracks grinding through the mud and debris. The effect was immediate and devastating. German defenses, considered impenetrable after years of trench warfare, were shattered within hours. The tanks tore through multiple lines of barbed wire, crushed machine gun nests, and created breaches that allowed the infantry to advance with minimal casualties. In just 6 hours, British forces advanced 8 kilometers, a feat that had taken months in previous battles. Eyewitnesses described scenes of utter chaos and terror among the German defenders. Many had never seen a tank before, and the sight of hundreds of armored monsters emerging from the mist was enough to break their resolve. Some surrendered on the spot. Others fled in panic, abandoning their positions. Machine guns, which had dominated the battlefield for 3 years, were suddenly useless against the tank's armor. Lieutenant Arthur Arnold, a British officer, wrote in his diary, "I saw a Mark IV cross 3 consecutive trench lines without slowing down. The Germans simply dropped their weapons and ran. It was like watching the war of the future." For the first time since the war began, the bells of London rang in celebration. Newspapers across Britain proclaimed the triumph of the tanks, hailing them as the weapon that would finally end the slaughter. The psychological impact was enormous, not just on the enemy, but on the Allies as well. Soldiers who had once doubted the value of the tank now saw it as a symbol of hope, a machine that could save lives and restore movement to the battlefield. But the victory at Cambrai was not without its complications. The Germans, stunned at first, quickly regrouped. They brought up heavy artillery and launched a fierce counterattack, recapturing much of the lost ground. Many tanks broke down or ran out of fuel, and the limitations of the technology were once again laid bare. In the end, the battle was a tactical draw. But strategically, Cambrai was a turning point. The tanks had proven beyond any doubt that they could break through defenses that had withstood years of artillery bombardment. The concept was valid. The technology worked. The future of warfare had changed. News of Cambrai spread quickly, reaching even the most skeptical corners of the military establishment. In the United States, the same War Department that had dismissed Triton's tanks as useless now sent urgent delegations to Britain, desperate to learn everything they could about the new weapon. Colonels who had once ridiculed the rhomboid design now studied it with reverence, taking notes and asking questions. The American press, always eager for a dramatic turnaround, published stories about the miracle machines that had turned the tide of battle. For William Triton, the vindication was bittersweet. He had spent years fighting for his vision, enduring ridicule, rejection, and personal sacrifice. Now, at last, the world recognized the value of his work. Letters poured in from soldiers and officers, thanking him for the machines that had saved their lives. The British government awarded him honors, and his name appeared in newspapers across the country. But Triton, ever the pragmatist, knew that the work was far from finished. The tank was still evolving, and the war was not yet won. The aftermath of Cambrai marked a new phase in the development of armored warfare. The British Army, once hesitant, now embraced the tank as a central part of its strategy. Production ramped up, with factories working around the clock to build improved models. Triton and his team continued to innovate, addressing the flaws that had been exposed in battle. They developed new track designs, more reliable engines, and better armor. They experimented with specialized variants, supply tanks, bridge, laying tanks, and even recovery vehicles to rescue damaged machines from the battlefield. The psychological impact of Cambrai extended far beyond the Western Front. In Germany, military planners scrambled to develop their own tanks, studying captured British models and analyzing every detail. In Russia, engineers took note of the new tactics, laying the groundwork for future armored doctrines. The age of the tank had arrived, and the world would never be the same. But for Triton, the victory at Cambrai was more than just a professional triumph. It was a deeply personal moment, a validation of years of struggle, a rebuttal to every critic who had called him a dreamer or a fool. He had proven that innovation could triumph over skepticism, that persistence could overcome rejection. The tank, once dismissed as a technological dead end, was now the weapon that everyone wanted. Yet, even in victory, Triton remained acutely aware of the cost. The tanks he had built were saving Allied lives, but they were also instruments of destruction. He never romanticized his invention, never lost sight of the moral ambiguity at its core. In his private journals he wrote, "I created something that saves lives, but also takes them. There is no way to separate these realities. The engineer who builds a bridge cannot control whether it is used for commerce or invasion. I can only hope that my net contribution is positive." As the war ground on, Triton continued to push the boundaries of what was possible. He worked with American engineers to adapt British designs for mass production in the United States, sharing every lesson learned, every hard-won insight. He trained new generations of tank crews, passing on the knowledge that had been forged in the fires of failure and redemption. The legacy of Cambrai was not just a new weapon, but a new way of thinking about war. The tank had shown that technology, when combined with vision and determination, could change the course of history. It had shattered the old certainties, forced generals to rethink their strategies, and given hope to soldiers who had known only despair. For William Triton, the journey from humiliation to redemption was a testament to the power of persistence. He had faced rejection, ridicule, and doubt at every turn. But he had never given up. He had believed in his vision even when no one else did. And in the end, he had changed the world. But the story was far from over. The war still raged, and new challenges awaited. The tank, once a symbol of hope, would soon become a central player in the most destructive conflicts the world had ever seen. Triton's invention had opened the door to a new era of mechanized warfare, one that would test the limits of human ingenuity and the boundaries of human conscience. As the guns fell silent over Cambrai and the world took its first tentative steps into the future, one thing was clear: the age of the tank had begun, and at its heart was a quiet engineer from London whose refusal to accept defeat had changed the course of history. The triumph at Cambrai was a turning point, but for William Triton it was not a moment to rest. If anything, the taste of vindication only sharpened his drive. The world now saw the tank as a weapon of the future, but Triton saw only its flaws, its mechanical failures, its vulnerabilities, its untapped potential. The battlefield had proven the concept, but the engineer in him knew that the work had only just begun. The months after Cambrai were a blur of activity. The British government, finally convinced of the tank's value, poured resources into production. Factories in Lincoln and beyond ran day and night, churning out new machines as fast as steel and sweat could allow. But mass production brought new challenges. The Mark IV, the hero of Cambrai, was still plagued by breakdowns, overheating engines, and tracks that could snap under the strain of battle. Triton was determined to fix these problems, not just to silence his critics, but because he felt a personal responsibility to the men who rode into battle inside his creations. He became a fixture on the factory floor, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with grace. He listened to the stories of tank crews returning from the front, stories of engines that seized up in the mud, of armor that buckled under direct hits, of desperate repairs made under fire. Triton took every complaint as a challenge, every failure as a lesson. He filled notebook after notebook with sketches, calculations, and ideas for improvement. His mind never stopped working, even as his body began to show the strain of endless days and sleepless nights. One of his first priorities was the engine. The original Daimler engines, adapted from commercial vehicles, were never designed for the brutal demands of trench warfare. They overheated, broke down, and left crews stranded in the worst possible moments. Triton worked with his team to develop more robust engines, experimenting with new cooling systems and more reliable components. He pushed suppliers to deliver higher quality parts, refusing to accept anything less than perfection. But the engine was only the beginning. Triton also tackled the tank's steering system, which had been a nightmare from the start. Early models required 4 men to coordinate the controls. 1 for the throttle, 1 for the brakes, and 2 for the tracks. In the chaos of battle, this was a recipe for disaster. Triton and Major Wilson, his trusted collaborator, devised a new epicyclic gear system that allowed a single driver to control the tank. It was a breakthrough that dramatically increased the tank's effectiveness and survivability. Armor was another constant concern. The Mark IV's steel plates could stop rifle bullets, but they were vulnerable to artillery and armor-piercing rounds. Triton experimented with new alloys, thicker plates, and sloped surfaces to deflect incoming fire. He worked with metallurgists to find the perfect balance between protection and weight, knowing that every extra pound made the tank slower and more likely to bog down in the mud. Triton's relentless pursuit of improvement extended to every aspect of the tank. He oversaw the development of specialized variants to meet the evolving needs of the battlefield. There were supply tanks, unarmed but capable of carrying ammunition and fuel to the front lines. There were bridge-laying tanks, equipped with collapsible structures to span the widest trenches. There were even recovery tanks, designed to tow damaged vehicles back to safety. Each new variant was a response to a specific problem, a testament to Triton's belief that no challenge was insurmountable. The Mark V, introduced in 1918, was the culmination of these efforts. It featured a more powerful engine, improved armor, and the revolutionary single-driver control system. It was longer, stronger, and more reliable than any previous model. The Mark V's starred variant was even longer, capable of crossing trenches that would have swallowed earlier tanks whole. These machines were not just weapons. They were the embodiment of Triton's philosophy, that progress is a process of constant refinement, of learning from failure and never settling for good enough. But the relentless pace took a toll. Triton's health, already fragile, began to deteriorate. He suffered from chronic insomnia, stomach ulcers, and a persistent cough that refused to go away. His colleagues worried about him, urging him to rest, but Triton would not slow down. He felt a moral obligation to the soldiers who depended on his machines. As long as men were dying in the trenches, he believed he had no right to rest. The psychological burden was immense. Triton was acutely aware of the dual nature of his invention. The tanks he built saved Allied lives, but they also brought death and destruction to the enemy. He never romanticized his work, never lost sight of the moral ambiguity at its core. In his private journals, he wrote, "I have created something that saves lives, but also takes them. There is no way to separate these realities. The engineer who builds a bridge cannot control whether it is used for commerce or invasion. I can only hope that my net contribution is positive." Despite the toll, Triton's innovations continued to shape the course of the war. The Battle of Amiens in August 1918, sometimes called the Black Day of the German Army, was a showcase for the new tanks. More than 500 British and French tanks, supported by infantry, artillery and aircraft, smashed through German lines in a coordinated assault. The psychological impact was devastating. German Commander General Erich Ludendorff later wrote that Amiens was the moment he realized Germany had lost the war. The combination of tanks, planes, and artillery had rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete. Triton received reports from the front with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His machines were saving Allied lives, yes, but they were also killing German soldiers in horrific numbers. He never allowed himself to forget the human cost of his work. He visited wounded tank crews in hospitals, listened to their stories, and promised to make their machines safer, stronger, and more reliable. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a servant, someone whose duty was to solve problems, no matter how difficult or painful. The scale of production in 1918 was staggering. British factories were turning out more than 100 tanks a month, a feat that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Foster and Company, once a modest manufacturer of agricultural machinery, had become the beating heart of Britain's armoured forces. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The workers, inspired by Triton's example, pushed themselves to the limit. They knew that every tank they built could mean the difference between life and death for the men at the front. But not every innovation was a success. Some experimental designs, like the amphibious tank, failed spectacularly in testing. Others, like the Mark VA, never made it past the prototype stage due to chronic structural problems. Triton documented every failure with the same care he gave to his successes. He believed that progress was built on the lessons of defeat, that every setback was an opportunity to learn and improve. As the war drew to a close, Triton's relentless pursuit of perfection had transformed the tank from a crude experiment into a formidable weapon of war. The machines that rolled onto the battlefield in 1918 were a world away from the lumbering prototypes of just 2 years earlier. They were faster, stronger, and more reliable, proof that innovation is a journey, not a destination. But the end of the war brought new challenges. The factories that had once hummed with activity now faced an uncertain future. The demand for tanks evaporated almost overnight, and many workers were laid off. Triton, exhausted and in poor health, struggled to adjust to peacetime. He lobbied for the preservation of some tanks as historical monuments, understanding that he had been part of something truly significant. But the world, eager to move on from the horrors of war, was slow to recognize the importance of his work. For Triton, the years of relentless innovation had come at a high personal cost. His health was broken, his company was struggling, and his invention, once hailed as the savior of the Allies, was now seen by some as a relic of a dark and violent past. Yet even in the face of disappointment and decline, Triton never lost faith in the power of persistence. He continued to tinker, to invent, to dream of new solutions to old problems. His legacy was not just the tanks that rolled across the battlefields of Europe, but the spirit of relentless innovation that he embodied. Triton proved that progress is not the result of a single breakthrough, but of countless small improvements, each one built on the lessons of failure. He showed that true greatness lies not in never falling, but in rising every time you fall. As the world moved into a new era, the lessons of Triton's tireless pursuit would echo far beyond the factories of Lincoln. The age of mechanized warfare had begun, and the relentless innovator who refused to give up had left an indelible mark on history. But the story was not yet finished. The peace that followed the Great War would prove fragile, and the world would soon be plunged into an even greater conflict. Triton's tanks, and the ideas behind them, would shape the battles of the future in ways he could scarcely have imagined. The relentless pursuit of innovation, once a matter of survival, would become the foundation of a new kind of warfare. one that would test the limits of human ingenuity and the boundaries of human conscience all over again. The guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Great War was forever changed, and so was the life of William Triton. For a brief moment, he was celebrated as a national hero. Newspapers hailed him as the man who had helped save Britain, the quiet genius whose machines had broken the deadliest stalemate in history. The British government awarded him the Order of the British Empire, and his name was spoken with respect in the halls of power. But as the months passed, and the world's attention shifted from war to peace, Triton's fame began to fade. The factories that had once worked around the clock to build his tanks now stood silent, their workers sent home, their machines gathering dust. For Triton, the end of the war brought a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. He had spent years living at the edge of exhaustion, driven by the urgent need to save lives and win the war. Now, with victory achieved, he found himself adrift. Foster and Company, the firm he had transformed into the birthplace of the tank, struggled to return to its pre-war identity. The demand for agricultural machinery was slow to recover, and the company's reputation was forever linked to the machines of war. Triton tried to steer the business back to peacetime production, but the world had changed, and so had he. Yet even as Britain moved on, the rest of the world was just beginning to grasp the significance of Triton's work. In Germany, where the Treaty of Versailles banned the development of tanks, military engineers secretly studied every detail of the captured British machines. They disassembled them, measured every bolt and plate, and took meticulous notes. The lessons learned from Triton's designs would become the foundation for a new generation of German tanks. Machines that would one day spearhead the blitzkrieg across Europe. In the Soviet Union, engineers purchased British tanks under the guise of research and development. They, too, took them apart, eager to unlock the secrets of their construction. The Soviets recognized the potential of massed armored formations and began to develop their own doctrines, inspired by the breakthroughs at Cambrai and Amiens. The Red Army's future juggernauts, the T-34s and KV-1s, owed a silent debt to the innovations of a British engineer whose name most Russians would never know. Even in the United States, where Triton's tanks had once been dismissed as useless, attitudes changed almost overnight. After Cambrai, American military officials returned to Lincoln, this time not as skeptics but as students. They studied the Mark V and its successors, took notes on every improvement, and asked Triton for advice on adapting the designs for American industry. The result was the Mark the Liberty tank, a joint British-American project that combined the best features of both nations' engineering. It was a powerful symbol of how quickly the world could change its mind, and how easily yesterday's failure could become today's essential technology. But the greatest irony was that, while foreign powers raced to build on Triton's legacy, Britain itself seemed eager to forget. The trauma of the war had left the nation exhausted and deeply suspicious of anything that smacked of militarism. Politicians slashed defense budgets, and the military establishment returned to its old habits, prioritizing infantry and cavalry over armored vehicles. The tank, once hailed as the savior of the Allies, was now seen by many as a relic of a dark and violent past. Triton watched this reversal with growing frustration. He wrote technical papers and gave quiet warnings, arguing that the world had changed and that Britain could not afford to fall behind. He pointed to the rapid advances being made in Germany and the Soviet Union, warning that the next war would be fought not with horses and bayonets, but with machines of steel and fire. But his words fell on deaf ears. The military bureaucracy, always slow to adapt, shelved his proposals and cut funding for research. The factories that had once built the Mark V now struggled to stay afloat, and Foster and Company, the company that had saved Britain, teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. The 1920s and 1930s were a time of paradox for Triton. He was honored and forgotten, celebrated and ignored. He received invitations to speak at international conferences, but he preferred the solitude of his workshop, tinkering with new ideas and refining old ones. He refused lucrative offers from foreign governments, insisting that his loyalty was to Britain, even as his own country seemed to have little use for his talents. The world was changing, but Britain was content to rest on its laurels, blind to the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Meanwhile, in Germany, a new generation of military thinkers was taking Triton's lessons to heart. Major Heinz Guderian, who would become the architect of the Blitzkrieg, studied the battles of Cambrai and Amiens with obsessive attention. He understood what many in Britain had forgotten, that the future of warfare belonged to those who could combine speed, firepower, and mobility. The German panzer divisions that would one day sweep across Europe were, in many ways, the direct descendants of Triton's Mark V. The outbreak of World War II was a grim vindication of everything Triton had warned about. When German tanks rolled into Poland in 1939, the world saw the terrifying power of mechanized warfare unleashed on a scale never before imagined. Britain, caught unprepared, scrambled to revive its tank program. Military officials, some of whom had once dismissed Triton's ideas, now sought him out for advice. He was older now, his health broken by years of relentless work, but he answered the call. He served as a consultant, reviewing designs, identifying flaws, and offering solutions drawn from a lifetime of experience. The tanks of World War II were marvels of engineering, faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything Triton had built. The American Sherman, the Soviet T-34, the German Panzer, all bore the unmistakable imprint of his pioneering work. They were the children of the Mark V, shaped by decades of innovation and the hard lessons of 2 world wars. Triton watched their evolution with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was proud to have played a part in their creation, but he was haunted by the knowledge that his inventions had made war more efficient, more deadly, and more impersonal. In 1946, as the world struggled to rebuild from the devastation of World War II, Britain finally gave Triton the recognition he deserved. He was knighted by King George VI, a belated acknowledgement of his contributions to the nation and to history. The ceremony was emotional, a rare moment of public celebration for a man who had spent most of his life in the shadows. Triton, ever humble, insisted that he had merely solved mechanical problems, that the real heroes were the men who had fought and died in the machines he had built. William Triton died later that year, his body worn out by decades of stress and sacrifice. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including veterans of both world wars who owed their lives to the tanks he had created. His legacy was complex and profound. He had not invented the tank alone. It was the product of many minds, many hands, and many sacrifices. But he had been the driving force, the relentless innovator who refused to accept defeat, who saw possibility where others saw only failure. Today, the world's most advanced tanks bear little resemblance to the Mark V that first crossed the trenches at Cambrai. They are equipped with computers, laser targeting systems, composite armor, and guns capable of piercing almost any defense. But the fundamental principles, mobility, protection, firepower, remain the same as those established by Triton a century ago. The spirit of relentless innovation, the refusal to accept limits, lives on in every new generation of engineers and soldiers. Yet, for all his achievements, Triton remains a relatively obscure figure. There are few monuments to his memory. A plaque in Lincoln, a small museum with some of his original drawings, a handful of tanks preserved in museums. His story is rarely told in history books, overshadowed by the generals and politicians who commanded the armies he helped to equip. Perhaps that is fitting. Triton never sought fame or fortune. He was an engineer, a problem solver, a man who believed that progress was built one screw at a time. The ultimate irony of William Triton's life is that his greatest triumphs were recognized first by his enemies and rivals, and only later, grudgingly, by his own country. His machines were copied, improved, and unleashed on the world by those who understood their power, while Britain, the nation he had served so faithfully, nearly let his legacy slip away. But history has a way of correcting its mistakes, and today, the quiet genius from Islington is remembered as one of the true pioneers of modern warfare. His story is a reminder that innovation is rarely welcomed with open arms. The greatest breakthroughs are often met with skepticism, ridicule, and rejection. But for those who persist, who refuse to give up in the face of failure, the rewards can be extraordinary. William Triton's tanks changed the course of history, not because they were perfect, but because he was relentless. He never stopped asking questions, never stopped searching for better answers, never stopped believing that the impossible could be made real. And in the end, that is the true legacy of William Triton, not just the machines he built, but the spirit of persistence and possibility that he left behind. In a world that too often forgets its pioneers, his story endures, a testament to the power of quiet determination and the enduring impact of those who dare to dream beyond the limits of their time. As the world moved forward into the uncertain peace of the post-war years, the story of William Triton faded from the headlines. The world, eager to forget the horrors of the trenches, turned its attention to rebuilding, to new technologies, to the promise of a better future. But beneath the surface, the legacy of Triton's work continued to shape the world in ways few could have imagined. The tank, once dismissed as a useless contraption, had become the backbone of modern armies. Its silhouette, low-armored, bristling with firepower, became a symbol of 20th century warfare. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the city streets of Europe, tanks would dominate the battlefields of the next century. And at the heart of every one of those machines, in every gear and every bolt, was the spirit of relentless innovation that William Triton had embodied. But Triton's story is more than just the tale of a machine. It is a story about the nature of progress, the cost of invention, and the quiet power of those who work in the shadows. Triton was never a general, never a politician, never a man who sought the spotlight. He was, at his core, an engineer, a problem solver, a tinkerer, a man who believed that every challenge could be overcome with enough patience, creativity, and determination. His life was marked by rejection and ridicule, by setbacks and failures. The American military dismissed his tanks as impractical. British officials doubted his vision. Even after his machines had proven themselves on the battlefield, Triton found himself sidelined, his contributions overlooked as the world rushed to embrace the next new thing. But through it all, he never stopped working, never stopped believing in the power of innovation to change the world. The moral complexity of Triton's legacy is impossible to ignore. His tanks saved thousands of Allied lives, breaking the deadlock of trench warfare and giving hope to soldiers who had known only despair. But they also made war more deadly, more efficient, more impersonal. Triton understood this better than anyone. In his private writings, he grappled with the knowledge that his inventions had both saved and taken lives. "There is no simple way to judge this legacy," he wrote. "We can only acknowledge that every invention carries with it a burden of responsibility." This burden weighed heavily on Triton in his later years. He watched as his machines were improved, copied, and unleashed on the world by nations that had once dismissed them. He saw the rise of mechanized warfare, the devastation wrought by tanks in World War II, and the way his ideas had been twisted and weaponized by others. Yet, he never lost faith in the power of innovation to do good. He believed that progress, for all its dangers, was essential, that the only way to honor the sacrifices of the past was to keep moving forward, to keep searching for better answers. Triton's humility was legendary. When he was finally knighted in 1946, he accepted the honor with quiet grace, insisting that he had merely solved mechanical problems, that the real heroes were the men who had fought and died in the machines he had built. He refused to take credit for the work of others, always emphasizing the collective effort that had made the tank a reality. "No one invents alone," he once said. "Every breakthrough is built on the work of those who came before." Today, the world's most advanced tanks are marvels of technology, equipped with computers, sensors, and weapon systems that would have seemed like science fiction in Triton's day. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged: mobility, protection, firepower. The DNA of Triton's Mark V can still be found in every modern armored vehicle, a testament to the enduring power of his vision. Yet, for all his achievements, Triton remains a relatively obscure figure. His name is not as well known as those of the generals and politicians who shaped the 20th century. There are no grand monuments to his memory, no national holidays in his honor. His legacy lives on in the quiet persistence of engineers and inventors everywhere, in the belief that even the most daunting problems can be solved, that even the most unlikely ideas can change the world. Perhaps that is as it should be. Triton never sought fame or fortune. He was content to work in the background, to let his machines speak for themselves. His story is a reminder that history is not only made by those who stand on the battlefield or speak from the podium, but also by those who labor in obscurity, driven by a passion to make things better. The lessons of Triton's life are as relevant today as they were a century ago. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes risk, his refusal to accept the limits of what was possible stands as a beacon of hope. He showed that true innovation requires not just intelligence, but courage. The courage to fail, to be ridiculed, to keep going when everyone else has given up. His journey from the backstreets of Islington to the battlefields of France is a testament to the power of persistence. He proved that the greatest revolutions often begin with rejection, that the most important breakthroughs are born from failure. He taught us that progress is not a straight line, but a winding path marked by setbacks, detours, and moments of doubt. And perhaps most importantly, Triton's story reminds us that every invention carries with it a moral cost. The same machine that saves lives can also take them. The same technology that brings hope can also bring destruction. It is up to each generation to decide how to use the tools it inherits, to choose again and again between creation and destruction, between hope and despair. As we look back on the life of William Triton, we see not just the story of a man, but the story of an idea. The idea that progress is possible, that the world can be changed for the better, one screw at a time. His legacy endures in every act of quiet persistence, in every refusal to give up, in every dream of a better future. The next time you see a tank, whether in a museum, on a battlefield, or in the pages of a history book, remember the quiet engineer who made it possible. Remember the boy who took apart his family's clock, the man who refused to accept defeat, the innovator who changed the course of history without ever firing a shot. William Triton was no soldier, but his impact on the world rivals that of the greatest generals. He proved that the power to change history lies not just in the hands of those who wield weapons, but in the minds of those who dare to imagine something better. And in the end, that may be the greatest lesson of all, that progress, whether in war or peace, comes not from grand speeches or dramatic heroism, but from dedicated people solving difficult problems, one screw, one idea, one act of persistence at a time.